Thank you, David, for this very kind introduction, and more importantly, thank you for including me in this conference. So I've been looking forward to this weekend very eagerly because I knew that there was going to be such a group of mentors and friends and top-flight people. But I'm also anxious because in the room are the very people who I think are best equipped to tear up my argument. So to the extent that I'm working on anything these days, it's punishment. But I took the opportunity of this conference to write out a paper on territory because two reasons. I've had sort of a promissory note for years. I've sort of had footnotes saying, well, a persistent critic might press me on this question about territory, and then I gesture towards some answer. And I've been gesturing now for years. And it was high time that I tried to spell it out and see if that would actually work. And the reason to do it here is because my sense is that the three best people in the world working on these issues are all here. And that's Annie, and John, and David. And so what I'd like to do is try and motivate the question that's been vexing me and try and position the view that I'm trying to develop and defend in relation to theirs. And so I'm thrilled that everybody's here, but especially I get to pitch this with the three of them here. So the basic problem is that there's an account of political legitimacy, which I call a functional account, and it looks like it can't solve territorial questions. Territorial problems, and so we're going to need to supplement it with something else, maybe a transactional element, maybe a national element, and this is what I take it that people like David and John have been pushing. And what I want to do is today is I want to try and explain, well, maybe we can actually do more with this functional account. So let me explain the problem, and then I'll try and tell you my solution. So in my view, the most promising accounts of political legitimacy are functional, which is to say that they say the states are legitimate when they satisfactorily perform the requisite political functions. And the problem is that even if they can answer some questions, it looks like they don't do a good job with some core territorial rights. States are sort of pre-theoretically thought to have rights of jurisdiction, of border control, and of resources. Okay, and these are rights to be the territorial right of jurisdiction is to say that the country has exclusive dominion to make and enforce laws over its territory. The idea of border control is that the country gets to say who may enter the country's territory. And then the natural resources is the idea that whatever natural resources happen to exist on or underneath the soil of the country's territory belong to the country's constituents exclusively. And it doesn't look like functional accounts can do a good job here. And to appreciate their shortcomings, it might be helpful to compare them to more traditional theories of political legitimacy, which are transactional. So a transactional account of political legitimacy says that a state is legitimate just in case it's emerged from the appropriate transactional history. And the most popular version of this is social contract theory, where, for instance, in Locke's version, a state is legitimate when all of the landowners get together and they unanimously agree that there's consent to the state, and the state has, because of that consent, because of that actual transactional history, is legitimate to preside over the constituents and their property. And since this property includes the land, you can see why a transactional account of this stripe is going to be well positioned to explain territorial rights. Presumably, these initial contractors came with dominion property rights over their land, and they were able to transfer it. And so, not a big problem for transactional theorists. There are other problems, though, with transactional theories. As John pointed out long ago, this is normatively, there's nothing wrong with the story. Historically, It's just implausible to think that this transactional history has in fact occurred with actual states. Right? So in Locke's view, for instance, it's just descriptively false to say that we've had anything like the free and informed consent, morally valid consent of all of the constituents of any of the existing states. So John says, there you go, Locke's right about the normative stuff, he's wrong about the descriptive stuff, so we've got to be anarchists. And a lot of people said, yeah, that seems right. But a lot of people said, I'm not so comfortable with anarchists. And so the temptation is to develop some other account. And I think what's revealing is to look at why we're uncomfortable with anarchism. A lot of us think that life would be utterly horrific in the absence of a functioning state. And perhaps this explains why states can be justified even if they haven't gone through some kind of impeccable transactional history. And so if you believe, for instance, that life would be nasty, brutish, and short unless we had a state, then perhaps the state is justified whether or not everyone consents to it, because it alone is able to make sure that life isn't disastrous in this way. In other words, only states can perform certain functions. Okay, so that's why I call it a functional account of political legitimacy. Then the big question is, which functions? The most popular answer is justice. Justice can be cashed out in any number of currencies, but the most popular these days is human rights. So if you go this route, you'd end up saying something like a state is legitimate just in case it satisfactorily protects the human rights of all its constituents, where human rights are understood also in all kinds of ways, but my preferred flavor is as the standard protections against the protections against the standard threats to living a minimally decent human life. Okay, so this is, I think, a very attractive account of political legitimacy. It explains why we want states and which states are legitimate, which are illegitimate. The problem is that we now seem ill-equipped to answer these territorial questions. It would be easy if it turned out that, well, states could only perform these functions if they had complete absolute rights of jurisdiction, of border control, and natural resources. But the problem is that seems as descriptively implausible as the claim that everyone's consented to the state. So we need something else, right? And enter David. There you are. And I think David's going to say what we need to explain, for instance, why nations have some kind of connection to their territory, and if you either I suspect supplement, but it might be replace functional accounts with these national elements, then you can get the answers that you want. People like Annie have responded and say, no, this national account doesn't work. It's tempting to do that. I don't want to do that here. Rather than lob shots at the nationalists, what I want to try and do is say, well, let's look a little more closely at the functional account, and let's see if we can, how far we can go to justifying these territorial rights if we just stick with functional accounts without any national elements. So let's go through all three rights, starting with the right of jurisdiction, which again is a country's right to exclusively make and enforce laws for all those who inhabit the territory. At first glance, it looks like this is not going to be a tough nut to crack, right? Because it seems like states need to be territorial. They just wouldn't work any other way. Okay? It's not an accident that all existing states are territorially delineated. Right? It's because if we tried to sort people into different states according to eye color or religion or their preference for what state they wanted to be in, it would be mass chaos, because we have people of different eye color, people of different religions, and people with different preferences living amongst each other, interacting with each other. And what we need, as Kant emphasized, sort of uniform rules for all of those who are interacting with one another. And so this looks like we're off and running, and you can just tell a straightforward functional story for why states have claims to their territory. But I think this is too quick. It may explain why states need to be territorial, but it doesn't explain why states necessarily have the claim to their pieces of territory. And to see this, think about the prospect of a world state, right? So even if we assume, for instance, that we need states to perform certain functions, and that states have to be functional, and we assume, for instance, that Norway does a good job performing the requisite political functions, right? It does a very good job making sure that all of its constituents have their human rights protected, okay? Given that people interact now all over the world, right, not just with those who are physically proximate, why not have a world state? And imagine that a world state could do a better job securing justice. And so people wanted to put a world state together, and they said to Norway, you got to join in. What would give Norway the right to say, no thank you, we're going to play our own game. We want to join in. So what gives Norway the right to say, no, over this territory, we're going to play by ourselves? Given that, according to the functional theorists, the only thing that justifies their claim to the territory is that they're doing a good job performing this function of protecting human rights, then it looks like they would be impotent in the face of a claim by a world state which could do a better job. Right? So if it's just a functional analysis, whoever can perform the function better is going to prevail. But people don't like the world state for a lot of famous reasons. There are diseconomies of scale, or there are worries that if it ever became tyrannical, we'd be utterly defenseless, and things like that. So let's assume that those are right, and we need a plurality of territorially districted countries. Even then, Norway's going to have trouble, right? Because imagine that Sweden wanted to merge with Norway, or the European Union wanted to incorporate Norway. And imagine that Sweden could do a better job of performing the requisite political functions for Norwegians, formerly Norwegians, on Norwegian soil than Norway currently does. Right? Norway would have no claim, or if the European Union could do a better job. It seems if you just stick with straightforward functional analysis, there's no way to explain why Norway has a right to rebuff or to reject these overtures, these offers. So that's the pickle for the functional theorist. Now, not everybody is going to think this is problematic, right? So Albert Einstein is famous for saying something like the political state to which I belong doesn't play the least role in my spiritual life. Okay, I regard it as something like my relationship to an insurance company. Okay, so for him, if I was telling him, Norway has no right to reject the incorporation in the EU, he'd be like, yeah, whatever, right? I mean, so for instance, when I bought a life insurance policy when I had my first child, and then a year later I got a notice in the mail that company had been purchased by another company. I was like, whatever. It's just noise, right? Because it didn't change my premiums, it didn't change the amount that my beneficiaries would receive, and so I just, didn't really care. And Einstein, if we are to believe him, felt similarly about his country, right? Look, they're to perform certain functions, and as long as they're performing their functions well enough, then fine. No problem that Norway can't say, no, we want to play our own game. So I take it for granted that most of us probably ought to, we admire Einstein and ought to emulate him in a lot of ways, but I think we wouldn't follow him in this regard, right? So maybe Einstein's admirable because he said things like, I want to know God's thoughts, everything else are details, right? And so for him, whether he's a citizen of Norway or Sweden or Europe, are details. For most of us, that's not the case, right? For most of us, there's a big difference between our insurance company and our country. Our country plays a much larger role in our life, and we care a great deal about its character, constitution, and complexion, right? So if you feel that way, if you take sort of the Einsteinian view, then you don't think that the functional account has a problem. But many of us, I take it, think that no, there's something about Norway or Norwegians' claim to the territory. And so it looks like the functional account's in trouble. And what I think we ought to do is we ought to recognize that there's room within a suitably modified functional account for self-determination. And I think the thing to appreciate is that with functionally oriented rights, there's often we think in terms of thresholds. Okay? So think, for instance, about parental dominion. Donna and I are far from perfect parents, right? But presumably we do a good enough job raising our boys that it's our call how they should be raised. And we can't torture them or things like this if they misbehave, and we do a lot. But we have a broad discretion over things like whether they go to public or private school. And here's the key. Even if I have a neighbor who's much more knowledgeable about early education than we, the neighbor has a duty not to go take our children out of the public school and unilaterally put them into the local private school. Okay? And if she did this, she would be disrespecting our parental authority. Authority that we have over our children in virtue of our adequately performing, not perfectly, but adequately performing, our political chores, our parental chores, our parental responsibility. Okay? So I think we should tell us an analogous story about political authority. Right? So just as Donna and I have parental authority in virtue of performing the requisite, satisfactorily performing the requisite parental function, I think we could say that the Norwegians enjoy political authority over Norway, not necessarily because they do it perfectly, right? But because they do so satisfactorily. So there's a sort of threshold, and as long as they're above that threshold, they're legitimate, and they enjoy political self-determination. So that's, I think, the first and crucial move. And that's a big move, and I think it gets us going, but it's not going to get us far enough. And there are two possible objections. The first is about the implications it has, and the second is that maybe the argument doesn't work. So one of the implications that I think a lot of people wouldn't like of this type of account is that if Sweden has a duty to respect the sovereignty of Norway, just because Norway is able and willing to do a satisfactory job protecting the human rights of its constituents, then why doesn't Norway have a duty to respect the political self-determination of any internal parties that are likewise able and willing to perform the requisite political functions? Okay, so if there's a portion of Norway that wanted to secede from Norway, it looks like this account requires that they be entitled to do so, because there's a threshold, and as long as they're over the threshold, they qualify for political autonomy. And notice why a lot of people are going to reject this. I think a lot of people will be willing to concede that Norway might forfeit a right over some of its territory if it mistreated some of its constituents, or if there was a certain region that it treated particularly unjustly, they might forfeit it. But what's under discussion here is a much more jarring right of political self-determination, which says that even if Norway is behaving in an exemplary fashion, right, and some region comes and says, we want to separate, and Norway says, what did we do? And the region comes back and says, it's not you, it's us. We just want to play our own game, that they have a right to do so. And I think a lot of people will find that objectionable. I don't, and it's not just because I feed my family peddling that theory of secession. There are a couple reasons why I think that's actually the right response. The first thing to appreciate is that political coercion in general is so hard to justify precisely because it's non-consensual coercion, right? And we do so only because we say, as functional theorists, okay, we don't like coercion, we don't like the way it interferes in people's lives, but we're willing to say this is permissible because it's necessary to perform these vital functions, right? The situation is so grave in the absence of the state. But the key word there is necessary, right? The coercion, if this coercion weren't necessary, it wouldn't be justified. And that's precisely what's at play here, right? When there's a group in Norway that wants to secede and it can perform these functions on its own, it's not necessary that Norway as a whole coerce this region, right? So they can't claim the necessity, right? And the second thing I would point out is that this analysis is actually confirmed by the parental analogy, right? So Don and I are in a position now to make the call, for instance, about whether our children are homeschooled or they go to the public school or they go to private school and things like this. But I'm going to say when, not if, when the boys mature, presumably it'll no longer be our call, right? Whether and where they go to college won't be our call because our parental authority won't be necessary at that point. As they get to the point where they don't need it, then we wouldn't have dominion over their lives. And so I think that this account, although it certainly is at odds with the pre-theoretic notion of jurisdiction, because I think the pre-theoretic notion of jurisdiction is to say that a state, or at least a legitimate state, has a claim to the territory against all external and internal claims. And my view doesn't do that. It just gets us, it explains why Norway may rebuff Sweden, but it doesn't explain why it stands in the privileged position of dominion against an internal party. So I admit that this is not, I think, the pre-theoretic notion, but for me, this isn't that problematic. But there's another objection, I think, which is more telling. And this, I think, really helps us appreciate why David's intervention into literature is so insightful. So think about Donna and me, right? We got this claim over Alexander and Jackson, even if some neighbor could be a better parent. All right? Someone might come along and say, fine, that seems right. But notice, you can't, that's disanalogous to Norway, right? Because it's, in the case of you and Donna, it's not just that you're performing the function. It's also that you two made Alexander and Jackson, right? You have this natural connection to them as the biological parent. And it's only given that biological connection that you stand in that position where you have the authority as long as you perform the functions satisfactorily well. With Norway, though, right, there's not this natural connection between the Norwegians and the territory. They may be performing the function, but these Norwegians just happen to have been born on the soil, for those who were, right? And there's not the connection, there's only a functional thing. So we need some kind of extra functional component, right, to explain the link between the constituents and the territory. So enter David was saying, if we can explain why the Norwegian people as a culture have mixed their culture with the territory, right, now we've got this link, which makes it analogous to parental dominion, because it does involve a functional element. They wouldn't be legitimate, and they wouldn't have the claim if things were as dire in Norway as they currently are in Somalia, for instance. Right? But you can't tell the entire story functionally. And I think that's right. And this is where I've had the promissory note. But I don't think that what we need to do is we need to invoke a cultural claim. Instead, what I think is that there is an individual right of occupation. And the idea is that whatever you think about property, whether you think it's a natural right, whether you think it's a wholly institutional right, or some combination of those two, there is a pre-institutional natural right of occupation or occupancy, which just says that those who not unjustly, and I know that's big two words, and I'm not sure I've fleshed it out yet, but those who not unjustly reside in some place have a natural right to stay and live on the land, okay? And so the way I would draw it up is I think that I don't think that the Norwegian as a culture or the Norwegian as a political people or something like that has a claim to all of the territory. Rather, I think each of the individuals has a claim to stay where she is, not to be displaced, and although this isn't part of the right of occupation, I think that each of us has a right to be the citizen of a legitimate state as long as this is not too costly upon others. Okay. So what ends up happening is I think that individuals may stay where they are, they may have a right that their state operate a certain way, but they don't have a right that the state stay with its current configuration. Okay? So if you think in terms of Norway and Sweden, right? So Norway did in fact secede from Sweden in 1905. And maybe Norway and Sweden would want to join. Okay? I don't think there's any individual Norwegian or any individual Swede who would have her rights violated if all of a sudden these countries merged, as long as they performed the functions adequately well. I don't think that if they subsequently divorced again, that anyone would have their rights violated. And I don't think that there's a group which has a claim to the entire territory. But I think this right of occupancy is I think the missing element which needs to be fleshed out. So this is what I've been saying in footnotes since 2005, and this is what I think, if pressed, has to do a fair amount of work. And so it might be helpful to use, I think, an example that Annie Stills used in her excellent recent article, Nations, States, and Territory. Is that it? So Annie asks us, she says, okay, imagine that the occupying forces stayed in Germany after World War II, okay, to present. And now the Germans want to be independent. They want the occupying powers out, right? How do we explain that claim, okay? David says, I'll tell you how. There's the Germans, and I hope I'm not butchering views here. David says the Germans, as a cultural group, have mixed their culture with the territory. That gives them a special claim to it. So it's not just that they're able and willing to perform the requisite political functions. But there's this additional element, and that's what you need to explain why they're in a position to say, okay, you know, there was a time when your incursion and occupation was justified, but it's no longer justified. It's our territory. We want you out. Annie says, I don't like all this national stuff. It gives me the heebie-jeebies, right? But I think, she says, what you need to do is you need to understand that there's this political group, there's this political identification of the German people, and that when my term, not hers, when you've got a group like the Germans who perform these requisite political functions, they come to identify with each other. I don't think this is a conceptual point, it's an empirical point, I think. And that identification with each other and the territory explains why the Germans, as a people, not because of any cultural identification other than the fact that they've got to come together and perform these political functions, is going to be the explanation for why they have the claim to the territory. Right? Now, I worry that Annie's view is going to fall prey to the same types of objections that she presses against David. Okay? But the thing that I want to point out is, for me, I think I don't need to talk about the German people as a whole, either a cultural or a political group, right? Because I think there's just an antecedent right. If this group is able and willing to perform the requisite political functions, then they're entitled to self-determination, and they don't need to establish that they've got some cultural union or some political identification and some connection to the territory. That's enough, and that explains why they can say, okay, just like my children can say once they get to be a certain age, it's not your call how I live my life. These Germans can say, you know, we're politically viable now. It's not your call, you occupiers, how we run our lives. So I like my story better because it doesn't invoke these things that David has to invoke or that Annie has to invoke. But notice, right, that I think Annie is going to come back and say, yeah, but you know, the reason I invoke this is because I don't like this secession stuff, right? So you get the Germans' ability to evict these people really easily. But the cost is that then if a portion of Germany wants to secede, because the Germans as a whole don't have a claim to all of German territory, then they can do so. And I find that unpalatable. And so that's why I've been trying to fashion this out. Although he's not here, I think Alan Buchanan's view is different but related. So I think Alan is a functional theorist. I don't know that he put these in his terms, but this is the way I understand his view, is that I think Alan's a functional theorist who doesn't think there's any group rights and political self-determination. Okay? So for Alan,
I think he's going to say, he's going to avoid, he's not wedded to any of this stuff that David or Annie says, which makes some of us squirm. He also can avoid these secessionist implications, which make many of you squirm, right? But then the problem is, it looks like because he doesn't have any account of group self-determination, he can't explain why the Germans can evict the occupiers, all right, why they have a special claim to self-determination. Now, he may be okay with this, right? I mean, this is the Einsteinian view. This is the type of thing about which reasonable people can disagree. But to the extent that there's a sort of philosophically sophisticated version of Einstein's, or the position to which I'm ascribing to Einstein out there, I take that to be out. And then finally, you can think about John Simmons on this score, right? So we go to John and we say, you know, how do you explain the Germans' right to evict the occupiers? And he's like, what, are you kidding me? Right? It comes down to whether the transaction occurred. It hasn't occurred for either, and so this is just silly, right? You know, it's like somebody coming in and saying, you know, I got my slave here, right? And David's trying to take my slave. And I was like, no, she was my slave, right? Hands off, because my dominion over the slave, I don't have any dominion over the slave. It's totally illegitimate, right? And just because I was violating her rights first doesn't mean that I got some special claim that, you know, you leave me alone and let me violate. And I think that that John would say, look, you know, the German government was illegitimate initially because it didn't garner the required consent of the people. And then you got this new illegitimate government which comes in and starts violating the rights more recently. And it's just sort of wrong-headed to sort of be scrambling to get your theories to come up with this implication that you want about this thought experiment. So I think that's the lay of the land. I went over jurisdiction at the greatest length. Let me go over border control and resources a little more quickly. Border control is, again, the idea that, look, it's Norway's territory, right? So if anybody wants to come in, it's Norway's call whether or not they may come in, right? And how do you explain this? First impulse is to say, well, look, we need this in order. If we don't have control of the borders, we can't perform the requisite political functions, right? So as a functional analysis, a functional theorist, right, I can explain why we need this control. But I think that's not right. It may be that some particularly desirable states need to have some control in order to perform the functions reasonably well, but that certainly wouldn't explain why all states need this control, or even all legitimate states. There are plenty of states that frankly just aren't that popular, right? And they can't honestly claim that unless we were allowed to keep everybody out, we couldn't function. And even the very popular ones, even Norway, which would be flooded, right, if they had no control, can't claim they have to have complete control. Presumably there's some control that they might have to have. It may be empirically true that if they weren't allowed to limit the numbers to some extent, right? If you just stick with a functional account, you're not going to get anything like the right of border control, which we pre-theoretically want to ascribe to states, or at least to legitimate states. So, not surprisingly, what I think you need to do is you need to make the same move I made in the first section, which is have the idea of a threshold, have the idea that the threshold makes a legitimate state, and legitimate states are entitled to self-determination. So there are basically three core premises in the argument that I think is most promising. The first is that legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination. The second is that freedom of association is an integral component of self-determination. And the third is that freedom of association gives you the right not to associate with others, to refuse association. The first of these, if it isn't clear from the first section, it's not going to be clear now. So that's what I tried to explain in the first section. So let me focus on the second two, the idea that freedom of association is integral to self-determination and that it includes the right to refuse. And you can see this, I think, if you could look at all kinds of groups and clubs. You could look at the University of Richmond or things like this, but I think it's most vivid if you think about an individual and a right of personal freedom of association, in particular with respect to marriage. Okay? So if my father has the right to choose my marital partner, right, if he chooses well, and not my father, who probably chooses better than I, most of them, I might lead a happy life. But it's clear that I wouldn't be self-determined. I wouldn't be the author of my own life, right? Unless I get to choose who my marital partner is, or whether or not I get married, right? And this shows the second component is not just that freedom of association isn't just the right to get married, right? It's the right to exclude prospective suitors and to say, I don't want to marry you, I don't want to marry you, or maybe I want to marry nobody, right? So unless you have freedom of association, you don't have self-determination. So what I allege then is that political communities, like the Norwegians, wouldn't be self-determining unless they had the freedom of association, whether or not to associate with people. So for instance, the reason why many of us, think that there's something objectionable about Sweden being able to forcibly annex Norway is it looks like it's Norway's call whether or not they want to associate with Sweden or the European Union, right? And to the extent that they're denied that, their self-determination is disrespected. And I'd say the same thing about a Swedish immigrant, right? If some individual Swede wanted to immigrate into Norway, obviously the stakes are much lower when we're talking about one immigrant, but it's the same thing. If the Norwegians get to decide whether or not they want to invite this person into their political community, all right? And so I think this is the type of story that you have to tell. So if you just have a sort of straightforward functional account, you're not going to get anything like border control. I'd like to think that if you can, put in the stuff about self-determination at the threshold, then you can explain why the Norwegians have this claim over the territory. The problem is, as good folks like Sarah Fine have pushed me on, that there's a disanalogy between marriage and immigration. Because in marriage, it's not, in marriage you merely say, I'm not going to associate with you, and you exclude someone from the association. Norway wants to say, we don't want you in the association, and you may not come onto the territory. Okay? So there's the additional element. So that analogy may be too quick. So again, here's where we have a territorial element that needs explanation. And I think the first step, I don't think it's sufficient, but it's necessary. The first step is to appreciate that. I think that states, in order to be legitimate, have to treat all of their constituents as free and equal. Okay? And so there's a requirement that if they let anybody in, the egalitarian prong of this is that if they let anybody in, they've got to let them in as equal citizens. All right? They can't say, okay, you can come in and you can be on the territory, but you can't have a right to vote. You can't have any political protections and privileges the rest of us have. Okay, so in order to be on the territory, it's incumbent upon the state to include them in the political community. So the two are intertwined, I think, if you buy into this idea that there's an egalitarian requirement that everyone be treated as equal citizens. I think this goes some way. I'm not sure that it goes far enough, though, because you may say, all right, well, fine, they're connected, but, the community, the exclusion from the community is one thing, and your claim to the territory is much weaker. And so if it needs to be supplemented, then I'm going to again supplement with the individual right of occupancy. So if it is the idea that the Norwegians have to have some claim to territory, I don't think it's going to be that the group as a whole has a claim to all of the territory. It's going to be the link, if there's a missing link between Norwegians and the Norwegian soil, then it's going to be explained in terms of the right of occupancy. So I'm not sure that extra move is needed. I think Sarah thinks it's needed. But if it is needed, that's how I respond. I'm really not sure if that response would be adequate. Okay. Two things I want to point out, though, before moving to natural resources. Even if it does work, and I appreciate that that's a big if, there are going to be two shortcomings to this. The first is the whole idea is built upon the idea that we need to respect the self-determination of legitimate states. And I think that's right, and I think that's an important value, but certainly not the only value. Right? And so it just gives us a presumptive claim. It's going to, if we assume, which as I think we ought to, that Norway is a legitimate state, it merely gives it a presumptive right to exclude immigrants. It doesn't give it an absolute right. And so then it turns out that we're going to have to weigh the competing rights of people who want to get in, and those might be weighty. Okay? Most people who work in this area think that the obvious counterexample is refugees. I'm not convinced of that. Not because I think we can turn our back on refugees, but my own view is that the Norwegians have a disjunctive duty to help refugees. They must either allow them to immigrate and give them refuge in Norway, or they must help them where they are or give them assistance so they can get somewhere else where they have refuge. And so if Norway wanted to jealously guard its political membership, then I think it would be well within its rights to help refugees in other ways. And so I don't think the refugees are necessarily a decisive counterexample. But I think there are other examples, like, for instance, family members who want to reunite with people who are in the country. And it seems to me that's a very pressing claim. There's no reason to think that wouldn't necessarily outweigh the presumption in favor of political self-determination. And it seems like it's the type of thing that you can't help people elsewhere. They have to be reunited. And so there could be exceptions. And so some people aren't going to like that, because I think pre-theoretically, a lot of people think that the border control is an absolute right, and that's implausible. The other thing that I want to highlight is that...
Much highlighted for you.
There you go. The other thing I want to highlight is that this would only get us restrictions on immigration. It wouldn't get us restrictions on other kinds of traffic across the border. Okay? Because notice, the idea that's doing work for me is this egalitarian, this relational egalitarian premise, which says that if someone's going to be part of the community, they have to be full and equal members, right? But there are plenty of people who visit for shorter stays, either as tourists or business people, to whom this wouldn't apply. So if I visited Norway for a semester as a visiting professor in Oslo, I don't think there'd be any problem with not, giving me the right to vote in local elections for 4 or 5 months. Okay. Given that my argument depends upon this relational egalitarian premise, and this premise wouldn't apply to tourists and visitors, my argument as it stands doesn't give us an explanation for why we can control our borders against non-immigrants who just want to visit for shorter periods. And so, again, I think that the pre-theoretic idea is that there's an absolute right against all traffic across the borders, and I haven't come close to that. Now, maybe my argument can be supplemented. Maybe you can invoke self-determination to explain why, if there are too many visitors, too many tourists, or things like that, it would interfere with our ability to function a certain way or our rights of occupancy. That might be plausible, but I haven't done it. Okay, lastly, sorry I'm going on longer than I meant to, but I want to talk about natural resources. And here I just leave with a confession that I think functional theorists aren't going to be able to explain this. But I'm not sure that's wrong. Right? So there's a pre-theoretic notion that the Norwegians have all the rights and the natural resources in the territory, right? And again, the stock move, if you're a functional theorist, if you want to try and ground this right, is to explain that, well, we have to have property rights to all of these resources. We have to own exclusively the North Sea oil, for instance, because we wouldn't be able to perform the requisite political functions otherwise. And that just seems false, right? So if there's some foreigners who own land and various interests in Norway and on Norwegian soil, it's not clear to me why, and that doesn't interrupt their effective performance of the requisite political functions. It's not clear to me why everyone in the world can't have an equal claim to the North Sea oil. So if we're going to come up with an account, we're going to have to, I think, supplement the account And again, I just need to concede that I don't know how it would work. I can't explain the link between being a Norwegian and then having the requisite moral connection to these resources that would give you exclusive property rights over it. If you somehow deserved, worked really hard, and therefore deserved to be born on Norwegian soil, okay, but it seems to me that's not accurate, right? You just happen to have been born there. And I'll give you a thought experiment, which was not mine, but somebody else suggested it to me, which I think is really illustrative. And that is, imagine that there's a volcano in Norway. It erupts, huge plumes of smoke, right? And winds blowing over Sweden, and they hover over Sweden for weeks. No airline traffic for weeks over Sweden because of this volcano eruption in Norway. And that means that the air traffic is grounded, and it does billions of dollars of damage to the economy. And Sweden go to Norway and say, you owe us reparations for billions of dollars. It seems to me the Norwegians say, we're not responsible, right? They might be liable if there was industrial pollution which went over. But it's just mere natural fact that there happened to be this volcano which created the smoke which harmed the Swedes is not enough to explain why the Norwegians would be morally liable to have to pay compensation. That seems right to me. But if that is right, then, and we want to concede that Norwegians aren't liable for natural occurrences which happen to harm others, then why think that Norwegians have a morally privileged position of ownership over natural resources, such that they can exclude Swedes from the North Sea oil, things like this. A more promising route, I think, is going to be to say, okay, well, we can't explain why the Norwegians own the natural resources, but we can explain for practical reasons why we have to act as if they do, because they wouldn't be able to function. And you can think of some nice examples here. You could imagine that Chad, for instance, which has a horribly new political infrastructure. Imagine that vast oil resources were found. Right? You would worry that unless the Chadians were able to control foreign access to this oil, that their chances of self-determination are nil. Right? Or imagine, for instance, that oil was discovered under Mecca. And Saudi Arabia had no right to tell foreign firms, you can't come in here and access this. Right? You're really okay with that, Wellman? And I'd say no and no. Right? I think that absolutely we want the Chadians to have some kind of protection. Right? But two things important about this. One is that doesn't mean the Chadians own the oil, or even that we should act as if they do own the oil and they exclusively can consume it. Rather, we should appreciate that ownership includes this very complex constellation of Hofeldian advantages, only some of which involve controlling access and limiting other people's access to it. And if we want to say that, and as I think we should, that the Chadians should have some say, if not the decisive say, in excluding foreigners from accessing these resources, that's fine, but that's far different from ownership. And second of all, even if we're going to allow it in the Chadian case, and I think it is most motivated in the case of developing countries, it's not clear that that would apply to the Norwegian case, right? So it doesn't show ownership, and it's not global. And then I think the Mecca case is really interesting, and I'll finish on this and then close, because I think it brings together a number of things. I do think that the Saudi Arabians should have the standing to exclude foreign firms from coming in and destroying Mecca and leveling this historic city in order to get access to these natural resources. Okay? But I don't think that this turns on the fact that they exclusively own the oil. So imagine, contrary to the fact, that there were no Muslims in Saudi Arabia. Imagine that they discovered this oil, and then a Saudi firm said, we're gonna go in and we're going to get this oil up, and we don't care that much about that. In my view, Saudi Arabia has a responsibility, not to fellow citizens, but to the Muslims of the world, right, to protect the physical integrity of Mecca. And so even in these cases, it would have not a right, but a duty. And the duty would not be owed to its constituents, but to those people for whom the city is religiously significant, to preserve the integrity of the city. Finally, you might also notice that this is a case where visitation might be really important. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that let's imagine the question whether Saudi Arabia is a legitimate country. From my view, it's entitled to political self-determination, part of which is freedom of association, and so you could imagine why they'd say, look, we don't want, I mean, Mecca is here, right? If every Muslim in the world could come live here, it would swamp us population-wise, dramatically change our culture, things like this. And you could imagine them saying, we don't want that to happen. Okay, so that might give them a claim. That might give Saudi Arabia a claim to maybe limit dramatically immigration into Saudi Arabia. But now imagine that Muslims want to visit. Foreign Muslims want to visit Mecca. It seems to me that Saudi Arabia has a much less strong claim against these people, right? And then they might say only X million a year may visit or things like this. That's understandable, right? They occupy this, they have to live here, things like that. But their self-determination is just one claim, which needs to be balanced by others. And the importance of visiting a religious site that's significant could very well trump. Okay, so where does this leave us? If all the arguments worked, it's a lot of arguments, a lot of ifs, probably implausible, it gets us some way towards the pre-theoretical rights. I think we can do what for me is a palatable account of jurisdiction, although I think other people are going to be uncomfortable with the amount of political self-determination that would be involved. It's going to give us some degree of control over immigration. And so I think it goes some, but not all the way to our pre-theoretic notion of border control. And it doesn't go very far at all towards natural resources. So whether you think the functional account is going to be adequate or not is going to depend upon how firmly and closely you adhere to these pre-theoretic intuitions. So for me, I'm comfortable with it, and I'm willing to say, yeah, I'll revise my first two territorial claims, and I'll scrap the third. But I appreciate that there are others for whom they can say no. This shows that if we assume that Wellman's done the best job, twisting and contorting the functional account in all kinds of ways to get these things, it's just inadequate. And so we need to scrap the functional account in order to adjust the territorial claims. Thank you.